2:30 p.m., July 15, 2015. Murphy's General Store, West Glacier, Montana. Jake and Luke Brennan bought batteries, fishing line, and a bag of ice. They laughed about who would catch the bigger trout. They paid in cash. They walked out the door. And somewhere in the 8 miles of forest between that store and Hidden Lake, 2 identical brothers simply stopped existing. For 4 years, no one could explain why. Then a drone found something. If this case already has you curious, make sure you're subscribed because it only gets more disturbing from here. The Brennan twins were not reckless people. Jake, the older of the two by 4 minutes, had spent 3 months studying topographic maps of the Blackfoot Valley before the trip. He had printed weather reports, marked trail elevations, and color-coded a hand-drawn schedule that included rest stops, fishing windows, and estimated hiking times. Luke had packed and repacked their gear twice, weighing each item against necessity. Their mother Linda later told investigators that she had never seen her sons more prepared for anything in their lives, which is what made the morning of July 15th slightly strange. Linda Brennan watched her sons load their silver Ford pickup from the front porch. She had seen them leave for camping trips before, laughing, distracted, tossing gear in carelessly. But that morning, she asked them 3 times whether they had their emergency radio. Not once, 3 times. She couldn't explain why. Jake assured her they were ready. Luke hugged her a little longer than usual. Neither of them looked back as they drove away. She would think about that hug for the next 4 years. At 2:30 that afternoon, Jake and Luke pulled into Murphy's General Store in West Glacier, their last confirmed stop before disappearing into the wilderness. Store owner Bill Murphy remembered them clearly. They were in good spirits, joking loudly about fishing, moving through the aisles with the ease of people who had done this many times before. They bought batteries for their flashlights, extra fishing line, and a bag of ice for their cooler. Standard supplies, nothing unusual, except they paid in cash. That detail alone means nothing. Plenty of people pay in cash, but Jake and Luke Brennan almost never did. Friends, co-workers, and family members all confirmed the same thing. The brothers used their debit cards for nearly everything, a habit so consistent that their bank statements read like a diary. Yet on the last afternoon anyone ever saw them alive, they paid cash, left no receipt, and drove north toward the Blackfoot Valley access road without stopping anywhere else. No one knows where that cash came from. Their planned campsite was near Hidden Lake, a remote location accessible only through 8 miles of narrow dirt road cutting through dense pine forest. No cell service, no regular ranger patrols. The brothers had camped there twice before and knew the terrain well. By every measure, this was a familiar, manageable trip for 2 experienced outdoorsmen who had grown up in these mountains. They were due home on July 20th. When that date passed quietly, their parents assumed the brothers had simply decided to stay longer. It had happened before, but July 21st came and went without a single call, and Linda Brennan knew immediately that something was wrong. In their entire adult lives, Jake and Luke had never gone more than 2 days without contacting home. Not once. She called the sheriff's office that evening, and the search that would consume the next 4 years of her life had begun, though nobody realized yet just how little they were going to find. The first thing investigators noticed was what wasn't wrong. Deputy Rebecca Stone arrived at the Blackfoot Valley trailhead on the afternoon of July 22nd expecting to find something. A sign of struggle, a hasty departure, evidence of a decision made in panic. What she found instead was a truck parked so carefully it almost looked staged. The silver Ford pickup was positioned in the shade, angled for easy exit, as if the brothers had expected to walk back to it within the hour. The doors were unlocked. The keys were sitting on the dashboard. Inside, neatly arranged on the seats and in the glove compartment, were both brothers' wallets, their identification cards, and a combined total of $340 in cash. Their cell phones were there too, both dead, both placed together as though set down deliberately rather than forgotten. Nothing was overturned. Nothing was scattered. There were no signs of struggle, no broken glass, no forced entry. The truck looked exactly like the truck of 2 men who had parked it, walked into the woods, and planned to return. They just never did. Stone noted something else that bothered her more than she initially let on in her official report. The tire tracks in the soft dirt around the clearing showed no other vehicles had been in that area recently. No overlapping treads, no evidence of a second car pulling up alongside theirs. Whatever had happened to Jake and Luke Brennan, it had not happened in that parking clearing. It had happened somewhere deeper inside the forest, beyond the reach of the road, in terrain that swallowed sound and footprints equally. And yet the truck itself kept pulling at her. The cash they had spent at Murphy's was gone, but $340, the exact same amount, was sitting untouched in the glove compartment, as if it had been replaced. The search dogs arrived from Kalispell the following morning. They picked up the scent immediately, pulling their handlers forward along the narrow trail toward Hidden Lake with the focused urgency that experienced trackers recognize as a strong lead. The team moved carefully. 6 rangers and volunteers spread across the trail with eyes low, documenting every broken branch and disturbed rock. For the first mile, there was nothing unusual. For the second mile, the same. Then, halfway to Hidden Lake, one of the volunteers spotted something hanging from a low pine branch beside the trail. It was a baseball cap, blue, slightly faded, bearing the logo of the Brennan family auto shop. It belonged to Luke, and it had not fallen there. It was hung deliberately, looped over the branch with the kind of careful placement that suggested intention rather than accident. The fabric was clean, undamaged, as if someone had paused mid-hike, removed it, and decided to leave it exactly there as a marker. A marker for what nobody could say. Less than a mile further up the trail, the search dogs stopped. Not slowed, not hesitated. Stopped completely at a rocky outcropping overlooking a steep ravine, their handlers struggling to understand what they were seeing. Scent trails don't end. They fade, they weaken, they scatter in wind. But they don't simply cease to exist at a precise location as though someone had drawn a line in the dirt and said, "Here, no further." The handlers circled the area repeatedly. The dogs found nothing. Jake and Luke Brennan's trail ended at that rock. And for the next 4 years, so did every answer. The search that followed was not small. Within 48 hours of the dogs losing the scent, the operation had grown into something rarely seen in Montana's search and rescue history. Additional teams arrived from surrounding counties. Helicopters flew systematic grid patterns over the wilderness, their thermal cameras scanning the canopy below for any heat signature that didn't belong. The Montana National Guard deployed aircraft and personnel, turning a missing persons case into something that looked, from the air, more like a military operation than a rescue effort. They searched for 2 weeks straight, and they found nothing. Not a sleeping bag, not a food wrapper, not a footprint beyond the point where the scent trail had ended. In 2 weeks of covering hundreds of square miles of Montana wilderness, with helicopters overhead and trained teams on the ground and search dogs working every accessible trail, Jake and Luke Brennan had left behind absolutely no physical evidence that they had ever moved beyond that rocky outcropping. The absence wasn't just unusual. According to veteran search and rescue coordinators, it was almost impossible. People leave traces, even in the most unforgiving terrain, even in the worst weather conditions. Experienced searchers can find something. A thread caught on a branch, a boot print in soft soil, a disturbed patch of moss. 3 people had never vanished from a Montana wilderness search without leaving a single recoverable trace. The complete absence of evidence was itself a kind of evidence, suggesting something that nobody on the search team was ready to say out loud yet. What nobody said out loud was this: the baseball cap had been hung deliberately. Someone had placed it there, and whoever had done that had also, apparently, left no footprints of their own. The official operation scaled back after 14 days. Periodic helicopter flights continued, and volunteer ground teams kept rotating through the search area on weekends. But the resources had to move elsewhere. The case remained open, technically active, practically frozen. And back in Billings, the Brennan family quietly began doing what families in these situations eventually do. They started filling the silence themselves. Linda Brennan organized private search parties every weekend the weather permitted. She studied satellite images of the Glacier National Park region late into the night, circling areas she felt hadn't been adequately covered, cross-referencing topographic maps with weather data from July 2015. She posted flyers across the region, appeared on local television, and offered a $25,000 reward for information. Money the family raised by selling their house and moving into a smaller apartment across town. The auto shop stayed closed. The sign in the window read, "Gone fishing, back soon." It stayed there through the first winter, then through the second. Customers stopped coming for repairs and started stopping by just to stand outside and look at it. The sign became a kind of monument, not to hope exactly, but to the particular cruelty of not knowing. Tom Brennan returned to work eventually, keeping the shop open as much for something to do as for any financial reason. Maps covered the walls inside. Volunteer search schedules were pinned near the register. The first anniversary of the disappearance passed. Then the second. In July 2017, a small gathering was held at the trailhead where Jake and Luke had begun their final hike. Family, friends, and volunteers stood together in the afternoon heat, placing flowers at the base of a pine tree. Linda Brennan read a letter she had written to her sons. She did not cry while reading it. People who were there later said that was the most difficult part to watch. By the third anniversary, even the most committed supporters had privately accepted what the evidence, or rather the complete absence of it, had been suggesting all along. But Linda Brennan had not. She had developed insomnia, spending nights scrolling through missing persons forums and satellite imagery, corresponding with other families across the country who understood what it meant to search for someone the world had already quietly given up on. She refused to stop, and it was that refusal, stubborn, sleepless, almost unreasonable, that would eventually change everything. Because in early 2019, something found what 4 years of human effort could not. If you're still following along, comment, "I'm here." It helps me know who's really engaged in these stories. The drone program almost didn't happen. A Seattle-based technology company had been developing advanced search and rescue drone systems for 2 years and needed a real-world test case. Something complex enough to stress their equipment but legitimate enough to justify the resources. They approached the Flathead County Sheriff's Office in early 2019 with a proposal that was equal parts generous and experimental. Deputy Rebecca Stone, who had never formally closed the Brennan case in her own mind despite the department's reduced involvement, heard the pitch and immediately said yes. Not everyone agreed with her. The department had already spent significant resources on the Brennan investigation across 4 years. Some members felt that further allocation toward what was now essentially a recovery operation, not a rescue, was difficult to justify. Stone pushed back quietly but persistently, arguing that the drone technology represented a genuinely new capability, not simply a repetition of previous efforts. The machines could access terrain that ground teams physically couldn't reach, and their artificial intelligence software could identify anomalies that human eyes would miss even at close range. Sheriff Walsh approved it. Barely. The operation was scheduled for late April 2019, when snow coverage would be minimal and weather conditions optimal. 3 state-of-the-art drones were deployed alongside 2 specialist operators who had previous experience in wilderness search missions. Each drone carried high-resolution cameras, thermal imaging sensors, and AI software designed to flag anything in the landscape that didn't conform to natural patterns. Irregular shapes, unusual color variations, geometric arrangements that nature doesn't produce on its own. Linda and Tom Brennan drove to the command post the morning operations began. Linda brought coffee and sandwiches for the search team. She had learned over 4 years to manage her hope carefully, building small walls around it to prevent the kind of collapse that had nearly broken her after previous searches failed. She watched the drones lift off in the early morning light and allowed herself something cautious and small. Not optimism exactly, but the quiet acknowledgement that this was different from what had come before. The first day covered familiar ground. The drones retraced the path toward Hidden Lake, expanding outward in careful grid patterns over terrain that had been searched repeatedly by ground teams. The high-resolution cameras captured thousands of images, each one processed in real time by software looking for anything that didn't belong. Hours passed. The footage was detailed and comprehensive, offering the most thorough aerial view of the search area that investigators had ever possessed. But the first day ended without a significant discovery. The second day pushed further. The operators expanded their flight paths into regions that had been flagged during previous searches as too remote or physically dangerous for ground teams to access effectively. One drone was equipped with sensors capable of detecting metal objects buried beneath vegetation or debris. The team worked methodically through the morning, the AI software processing incoming data continuously, measuring every shadow and surface irregularity against its baseline model of what undisturbed wilderness looks like. At 2:15 in the afternoon, the software flagged an anomaly. It was located in a heavily forested area nearly 6 miles from the original search zone, well beyond the boundary of every previous ground operation. The thermal imaging had detected a geometric pattern in the landscape that didn't match its surroundings. Not a heat signature, not a color variation, a shape, something underneath the fallen branches and accumulated forest debris that was too regular, too deliberate, to have been arranged by weather or time or the slow, patient work of nature reclaiming what humans leave behind. The drone descended. The camera focused slowly through layers of pine needles and fallen wood, adjusting its resolution until the image sharpened into something recognizable. A corner of fabric, blue, partially buried under years of debris but unmistakably synthetic, unmistakably man-made, unmistakably the kind of material used in camping equipment. At the command post, the live feed appeared on the monitor. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Linda Brennan looked at the screen, then looked away, then looked back. Tom put his hand on her shoulder. Deputy Stone leaned forward toward the monitor with the expression of someone who has been waiting 4 years for a single image and is not yet ready to believe they are finally looking at it. The fabric was real. The location was real. And whatever was buried beneath those branches had been lying there, completely hidden, completely silent, for 4 years, 6 miles from where anyone had thought to look. Within the hour, Stone had assembled a ground team and they were heading into the forest. They had no idea what they were about to find. But Stone already knew one thing. 6 miles off course wasn't a navigation error. Jake had color-coded his hiking schedule. People like that don't drift 6 miles in the wrong direction. They get led there. The hike to reach the site took 4 hours. Not because the distance was extreme, but because the terrain between the command post and the drone's flag location was the kind that doesn't appear on standard hiking maps. The kind that exists in the gaps between marked trails, in the spaces that experienced outdoorsmen avoid and casual hikers never reach. The team had to rope down a cliff face that dropped without warning from a seemingly flat ridge. They crossed a fast-moving stream that wasn't marked on any official survey, its water cold enough in late April to be genuinely dangerous. Twice the team had to backtrack entirely and find alternate routes around terrain that was simply impassable. Deputy Stone later said the journey itself told her something important. If 2 experienced brothers, familiar with these mountains, had somehow ended up in this location during a July night in 2015, disoriented, possibly frightened, moving without the benefit of a planned route or adequate lighting, the terrain alone could have been fatal. This was not wilderness that forgave mistakes. It was wilderness that collected them. When the team finally broke through the last line of dense pine into the small natural clearing, they stopped. The clearing was not large, perhaps 30 feet across, ringed by tall trees that closed over it like a ceiling, cutting it off from aerial view almost completely. In the center, partially collapsed under the weight of 4 years of fallen branches, accumulated pine needles, and the slow pressure of 2 Montana winters, was a blue camping tent. It was theirs. The fabric was faded, torn in several places where branches had pressed through during storms, bleached unevenly by the rare shafts of light that reached the clearing floor. But the tent was identifiable. The model, the color, the specific wear pattern on the rainfly, it matched the equipment list that Linda Brennan had provided to investigators in July 2015, a list she had compiled from memory in the hours after she first called the sheriff's office, because she had known her son's gear that well. The forensic specialist moved first, documenting everything before anyone touched anything. What the cameras captured in that clearing was a scene of profound and specific stillness. A camping stove sat beside a cold fire ring, positioned exactly as someone would leave it if they planned to use it again in the morning. Fishing equipment was laid out nearby with the same casual organization. Not packed away, not scattered, but arranged the way a person arranges things when they expect to return to them. Personal items were distributed around the tent entrance with the randomness of lived-in space rather than the disorder of panic or struggle. And outside the tent, lined up with a neatness that stopped every person on the team when they saw it, were 2 pairs of hiking boots, placed side by side, deliberately, as though 2 people had stepped out of them at the same moment, intending to step back in. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment saying, "I'm still here." I want to know who's really following this story. Inside the collapsed tent, the sleeping bags were unzipped and pushed aside, not folded, not packed, but thrown back the way a person throws back a sleeping bag when something wakes them suddenly in the night and they move before they are fully conscious of moving. Wallets were inside. Watches, medication, every item that a person would reach for first in an emergency had been left behind completely, suggesting that whatever had pulled Jake and Luke out of their tent had happened too fast for them to think about taking anything with them. They had left in seconds, in the dark, without their boots. Stone stood in the clearing for a long time before she spoke. The campsite answered one question that had defined the investigation for 4 years. The brothers had not vanished from the trail. They had made it somewhere entirely different from their intended destination, 6 miles off course in terrain that had no business being on their route, and they had set up camp and spent at least one night here before something had interrupted them completely. But the answer only sharpened the questions underneath it. How had 2 experienced brothers, with careful plans and color-coded schedules, ended up 6 miles from where they intended to be? What had they been following, or who that had led them this deep into terrain this difficult? And what had happened in this small, hidden clearing, in the darkness of a July night in 2015, that had pulled them out of their sleeping bags so suddenly that they hadn't stopped to put on their boots? The tent held its silence. The clearing held its silence. And somewhere beyond the ring of pine trees, in the vast indifferent wilderness that had kept this secret for 4 years, whatever answer existed was still waiting to be found. The boots were the detail that stayed with Stone through the night. Not the abandoned wallets, not the thrown-back sleeping bags. The boots, placed neatly, side by side, as though someone had told them to take them off. The forensic team spent 3 days at the campsite. Every item was cataloged, photographed, and carefully removed for analysis at the State Crime Laboratory in Helena. Dr. Patricia Wells, the state's chief forensic analyst, led the examination with the kind of methodical patience that 4 years of waiting had made feel almost unbearable to the Brennan family. Hair samples recovered from the sleeping bags were sent for DNA testing. Serial numbers on the camping equipment were cross-referenced against the gear list Linda Brennan had provided in 2015. The tent fabric was examined for any evidence of external damage, cuts, tears, burn marks, anything that might suggest what had happened inside that clearing. The DNA results came back first. The hair samples belonged to Jake and Luke Brennan. Definitively, unambiguously, both of them. The brothers had slept in that tent. They had been in that clearing. After 4 years of absolute silence, the wilderness had finally confirmed what the family had always believed, that their sons had made it deep into these mountains, had found shelter, had spent at least one night in that hidden space beneath the pine trees. But the forensic evidence did something else that nobody had anticipated. Complicated the timeline. The condition of the items inside the tent, cross-referenced against weather records from July 2015, suggested the brothers had been at the campsite for more than one night before they left. The fire ring contained ash layers consistent with multiple burns. The fishing equipment showed signs of use, hooks that had been baited and cleaned, line that had been cast and rewound. Jake and Luke had not stumbled into that clearing in a panic and spent one frightened night before disappearing. They had camped there, fished there, lived there for at least 2 or 3 days in apparent comfort before something had ended it all in a matter of seconds. Which meant the question was no longer what had happened to them on the trail. The question was what had found them after they had already settled in. Deputy Stone returned to the campsite with cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar while the forensic analysis was still ongoing in Helena. The dogs worked the clearing and the surrounding terrain methodically, their handlers watching for any behavioral change that might indicate human remains beneath the surface. The dogs showed interest in several areas near the campsite perimeter, pausing, circling, returning, but failed to locate anything definitive. The handlers noted carefully that 4 years of mountain weather could disperse scent evidence beyond reliable detection range. The ground-penetrating radar found nothing either. No buried objects. No disturbed soil patterns. No evidence of anything beneath the surface of that clearing that shouldn't be there. Whatever had happened to Jake and Luke Brennan after they left their tent, it had not happened in the clearing itself. They had walked out or been taken out, and the wilderness beyond the tree line had absorbed them as completely as it had absorbed every other trace of their existence. Then Walter Kowalski came forward. He was a retired Forest Service employee, 63 years old, who had been conducting an unofficial wildlife survey in the region during the summer of 2015. He had seen the renewed media coverage following the campsite discovery and had driven 4 hours from his home in Missoula to speak with investigators in person. He sat across from Deputy Stone in a small conference room and told her something that reframed everything she thought she understood about the case. On July 19, 2015, the day before the brothers were scheduled to return home, Kowalski had seen 2 young men near a creek approximately 2 miles from where the tent had been found. They matched Jake and Luke's description precisely. They were moving through the forest in daylight, calmly, without apparent urgency or distress. They were not lost. They were not injured. They were not running. They were following someone. Kowalski couldn't see who was ahead of them. The tree line was too dense, the distance too great. But the body language of the 2 men he observed was unmistakable. They were moving with the relaxed, unhurried confidence of people who trusted whoever was leading them. They disappeared into the trees within moments of him spotting them, and he had thought nothing of it at the time. 2 hikers following a guide into the forest was not an unusual sight in that region during summer. He had not reported it during the original investigation because it had not seemed significant. Stone thought about the baseball cap again, hung deliberately on a branch halfway to Hidden Lake. Had Luke left it as a marker for someone following behind, or as a signal for someone who might come looking later? The closer investigators got to answers, the more the earlier details stopped making sense in the way they originally had. Stone sat with that information for a long time after Kowalski left. The brothers had been alive on July 19th. They had been calm. They had been following someone they apparently trusted into terrain that was already 6 miles beyond where they were supposed to be. Whatever had happened to Jake and Luke Brennan was not a sudden accident on the trail, not a moment of panic in the dark, not 2 brothers making a single catastrophic mistake. It was a sequence of events that had unfolded across multiple days, in multiple locations, guided at least in part by the presence of another person whose identity nobody had ever established. The question of who they were following had no answer yet, but it had a name attached to it now. A name that investigators had pulled from the files of park rangers and wilderness enforcement officers. A name that kept appearing in reports from the remote regions of Glacier National Park across the years surrounding the disappearance. A man who knew these mountains better than anyone. A man who had been living in them, largely invisible, for over a decade. A man named Marcus Thornfield. For months, the investigation pulled in one direction, toward a person, toward intent, toward the possibility that what had happened to Jake and Luke was something someone had chosen to do, which is why nobody had thought to look down, and he was nowhere to be found. The answer, when it finally came, arrived from the most unexpected direction. In February 2019, a graduate student named Jennifer Hayes was researching historical land use patterns in Glacier National Park when she found records of an abandoned mining operation active in the early 1900s. The Copper Creek Mining Company had extracted copper and silver from the region between 1902 and 1918, then walked away without sealing their excavations. Dozens of mine shafts had been left open, slowly swallowed by decades of vegetation and erosion until they became invisible, unmarked, unmapped, and extraordinarily dangerous. One of those shafts was located 1 mile from the Brennan campsite. The opening was completely concealed beneath fallen logs and thick undergrowth, large enough for a person to fall through without warning, descending at a steep angle 200 feet into the mountain. A cave rescue team equipped with breathing apparatus and rope systems spent 2 days working through the underground passages before they found what 4 years of searching from above had never been able to locate. Jake and Luke Brennan were found together, as they had always been, The investigation concluded that the brothers had likely left their tent during the night, perhaps startled by a sound, perhaps simply stepping outside, and had fallen through the concealed opening in the darkness. 200 feet underground, with no way to signal for help and no route back to the surface, they had never had a chance. Linda Brennan received the news and finally, after 4 years, allowed herself to grieve. The mine shaft was permanently sealed. The auto shop sign came down. The apartment the brothers had shared was quietly emptied. But one question was never formally answered. Walter Kowalski had seen 2 calm, unhurried men following someone into the forest on July 19th. The mine shaft explained how Jake and Luke died. It did not explain who they were following, or where that person went, or whether they ever knew what happened to the 2 brothers walking trustingly behind them. Marcus Thornfield was never found, and the mountains of Montana have never offered an explanation. If this case stayed with you, leave a like and share your thoughts below. I read every comment,